A very warm welcome to this seminar organized by Tillotoma Foundation on politics in Sri Lanka and India-Sri Lanka relations. Tillotoma Foundation is a global organization working in the areas of international relations, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. The relations between India and Sri Lanka are crucial in terms of India's neighborhood first policy, as well as in terms of geopolitical competition in the Indian Ocean region. India recently abstained from voting on a resolution on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Today we have a very interesting discussion on politics in Sri Lanka and India-Sri Lanka relations with some distinguished speakers like Ms. Padma Rao Sundarji, veteran foreign correspondent. Padma Rao Sundarji is an award-winning veteran foreign correspondent based in New Delhi and the author of the book Sri Lanka, The New Country, which received excellent reviews in Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan. During her 14 years as the South Asia Bureau Chief of German news magazine Der Spiegel, Padma Rao covered current affairs in Sri Lanka and its long civil war as a war correspondent on the ground. Her work has appeared in Syndicate, in the New York Times, and the Herald Tribune, and in anthologies of writing by foreign correspondents in Germany and India. She has been a founding editor of WION television and national editor with the Hindustan Times, and continues to be a freelance contributor to various Indian and global media concerns. She writes in both English and German and speaks several Indian languages fluently. Dr. Gulbeen Sultana, research analyst, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. She has special expertise on Sri Lanka. Professor Baladas Ghoshal, distinguished advisor, Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian Studies, Tillotoma Foundation. Professor Ghoshal is one of the senior most and most respected scholars of Southeast Asia from India, with more than 50 years of experience. Today's discussion will be moderated by Professor Ghoshal. Let me now request Professor Ghoshal to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Soham. I think the thrust of our discussion today is internal dynamics of Sri Lanka politics and India-Sri Lanka relations. Now, while introducing the subject, I think I'll start with a couple of propositions or general statements, and then possibly we can elaborate on some of those issues or any other participants who would like to elaborate on those issues. The first proposition that I'd like to make is that bilateral relations, all bilateral relations, are always a function of internal, external, as well as regional environment, all impacting on the process through which any policy decisions or political discourses emerge. I think it's more so in the case of South Asia. And in that respect, South Asia, to my mind, is really unique. All the countries of South Asia actually face or have common borders with India, but none of the other South Asian countries have any border with each other. India has both land and maritime borders with all the countries in the region. That makes the relationship, particularly the bilateral relationship, is unique in many senses. There's an intermeshing of internal, external, and strategic environment in the analysis of foreign policies of these countries. All issues in the region are both domestic as well as external. We have people, Tamil-speaking people in Sri Lanka, Bengali-speaking people in Bangladesh, Urdu-speaking people in Pakistan, or Hindi, whatever we suggest. And we have it in our country as well, all that. The result is that all domestic issues assume a foreign policy dimension. So there is an intermeshing of internal and external dynamics. And obviously, the strategic environment in the region, how the external powers play an important role, or for that matter, geopolitical considerations or geoeconomic considerations arising from the regional environment also impact in the bilateral relationship between India and all the countries of the region. To a certain extent, some people even say that on occasions, some of the South Asian countries, in fact, even gang up the smaller ones against India, because it becomes much more easier for them to deal with a country which is almost 3 to 4 times larger in size if you combine all the other countries. Even in terms of economy of India is much larger compared to the others. So obviously there is an intermeshing of internal and external, and that is why in any kind of relationship between India and Sri Lanka, we cannot really avoid the dynamics of Sri Lankan politics and how it affects the relationship and also the policies that each of these countries devise in terms of dealing with these issues. And the role of the external powers, for example, China is an important factor, and obviously China plays a significant role in terms of India's bilateral relationship with the countries of the region. The second proposition that I would like to make is that people tend to view bilateral relations sometimes in terms of zero-sum game. That the gain of one country is the loss of another. And that's why one sees editorials, commentaries in India, which says, oh, China has gained in such and such place, India has lost. Now, to my mind, it is a very simplistic kind of an understanding. It need not have to lead to somebody's gain, need not have to lead to others' gain in all respects. There are many areas in South Asia. Yes. Anyway, there are many issues on which one might feel that China is gaining, but at the same time, those countries also have certain compulsions to keep India also in good humor because of the past history, because of economic links, because of a whole lot of other considerations. They can't afford to actually antagonize either one of them. So I would suggest that it need not have to be a zero-sum game. And relations are always, you see flow and ebb. On occasions, one country may gain, another occasion, another country may gain. So in retrospect, I think one has to take into account all the factors and need not have to restrict it to a kind of a zero-sum game. Now, the third proposition that I would like to make in this relationship is that principled and ideological stand can only be taken by large countries as well as people who have much greater capabilities. Now, if one has to look into India-China equation in South Asia or all other areas, one finds that China over the years has become much, much stronger, both in terms of the economy of the country is almost the 5 times size of India's economy. Then also in terms of capabilities, military capabilities, China has much bigger capabilities. China has much deeper pocket and it constantly engages in checkbook diplomacy and charm offensive to many of these countries. So automatically, there are certain asymmetrical gap between, the external powers and India. And as a result of which, sometimes India faces difficulties in dealing with some of the countries in the region. But what India tries to do, at least in the recent years, it has been making up that lack of capabilities in certain respects by developing equations with other countries of the region. For example, India's effort to build up the quadrilateral dialogue. I mean, it used to be a security dialogue at one time. It is no longer security. It also encompasses other issues, climate, technology, and all other issues are being combined. So one has to also take that into account in any kind of analysis of the relationship between India and Sri Lanka. And then I think sometimes we try to suggest that, oh, Nepal is now leaning too close to China, or Bangladesh is leaning too close to China, or Sri Lanka is leaning closely to China. I think it's very natural on the part of smaller countries to look for economic succor from countries which can offer them at much better rates, or they can offer much bigger economic sort of benefits to some of these countries. Most of the smaller countries lack capital as well as resources. So obviously they will have to depend on other countries. And whichever country can offer them much bigger kind of sort of benefits, obviously they will lean towards that. In the case of South Asia as well, we see that some of these countries are also looking more towards China for economic development or economic benefits, and that's why they have joined what is known as the Belton Road Initiative. In fact, all the countries, except India in the region, have joined the Belton Road Initiative. The last point that I would like to make on this general propositions that I made is that there is a difference between China's interactions with the countries of South Asia and the kind of interactions that India engages in. Whereas in the case of India, it is most of the time consultative, cooperative, and they try to coordinate their activities. And in fact, it's focused more on capacity building efforts of some of these countries. In the case of health, education, and many other technical support that India provides through its high-tech programs. In the case of China, it engages in those activities which benefits China more than the local sort of countries. And that is why you see what is emerging is some kind of a debt trap diplomacy or debt trap sort of phenomena vis-a-vis these countries. So in analyzing the relationship or bilateral interactions between India and Sri Lanka, we also have to take into account some of these factors. And then we can have a much greater understanding of this relationship. One point that I want to make is that some people are very unhappy that we have not really taken a principled stand in regard to the United Nations Human Rights Council decision regarding investigation into the human rights violations by the Sri Lankan government. We have taken a very neutral kind of a stand, abstained from it. I think it is influenced by much more an understanding of the fact that security, economic development, issues of terrorism. The last point that I wanted to make is that, sometimes the principal stand that one takes in relation to another country is sometimes compromised by the other security and economic considerations that sometimes these countries will have to keep in mind. People are quite unhappy in this country, at least a section of the people, that we have not adopted a principled stand on the question of human rights violations for the Tamil minorities that are being the victims in Sri Lanka. But I think what is happening in this region today is that because of terrorism, particularly after that bombing in Sri Lanka, that Easter bombing, security considerations are becoming much more important. Democracy is taking a much less. And that is how one can explain actually the success of SLPP in Sri Lanka. I think the success of this current government was essentially because of this particular fact. And had there been no, terrorist sort of activity, or that bombing had not taken place, I think the political process might have been also quite different in Sri Lanka. So what happens is that what we notice today is that democracy is being compromised, essentially because of other security considerations. And this doesn't mean one's own ideological preference, but I think one has to also take into account the realpolitik in this region. Now, with this comments, I think I'll take up some of these issues at a much later time, but I'll ask Ms. Padma Rao Sundarji to make her presentations, followed by, I think Gulbin would be the next presenter, and Ms. Sundarji.
Thank you so much, Professor Dr. Kusal, and thank you, Tillotoma Foundation, Soham, and everyone for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I haven't really come prepared with any kind of a statement on Sri Lanka, because the situation, as Professor Kusal pointed out, is so fluid and so evolving and so dynamic all the time. I mean, today, when I was trying to get an update on what is happening in Sri Lanka, I was already overtaken, within a couple of hours, as far as my knowledge of what's going on there is concerned. Just a few brief points I'd like to make. I was jotting down while Professor Ghoshal was speaking. There is, since we said that one of the thrusts of this discussion is going to be the internal politics of Sri Lanka, one thing that that in this relationship, India and its neighbors, since we are all ethnically and linguistically linked, therefore even goings on within individual countries tend to affect the bilateral relationship with India. That is absolutely correct. However, let's start with on that basis. And what is happening within Sri Lanka is interesting, because parties themselves, initially and for decades and decades, you only had the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which, like our Congress party, is the oldest party in Sri Lanka, and it was, run and led by successive dynastic rulers, dynastic presidents, and people from predominantly from the Bandaranaike family. After that, now what is the situation we have here? The SLFP, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party itself, is in disarray. Half of it sits this side, half of it sits that side. Many of its members, its stalwarts, have left and joined the Podujana Peramuna, the SLPP, which is Mr. Rajapaksa's party. The Muslim parties have also split, since the Easter attacks, because the Sri Lankan Muslim community is the second largest minority after the Tamils, and they have been very, very unfairly and brutally attacked and demonized in the immediate aftermath of the Easter attacks. But that hasn't always been the case, because it's been a very blended and very, very nicely interwoven social fabric in Sri Lanka. But there is a clear split there. There are people who are hardliners who feel that, yes, we want the freedoms, that, should we choose to wear the burqa or the hijab, which was not, ethnically sort of really seen very commonly in Sri Lanka over many decades, then we should have the freedom to do so. We should have the freedom to become more religious if we choose to. Now, there is a section in that community. There is another section which wants just the opposite. Then the SLP, as I mentioned, the SLFP, the Tamil National Alliance itself is split again. There is a faction of the Tamil National Alliance which is predominantly, consists of members of the families of former cadres of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE. So, and they are, obviously adopting a harder line. And it is said that many of them received some support from 12,000 cadres at least, which is the number that the armed forces highest commanders have given me and many others on many occasions, escaped the final phase of civil war that ended in May 2009, have settled and received refuge abroad in country in the name of human rights, in the name of freedom fighting, you know, and concepts like that in countries in the West, predominantly in France, in the UK, in Canada, etc. So you have that split within the TNA itself. And then you have the Colombo part of TNA, you know, these are the Tamils who live in Colombo, who, you know, the sort of more moderate faction. And then finally you have the UNP, which was the, you know, the kind of stable, stalwart opposition, United National Party, former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. There again, you have, for the first time, a split, you know, a perception split. You have Sajid Premadasa on the faction on the one side. It's not a clear-cut faction, but there are these, you know, there is this new dynamic that has come into the UNP as well. So it's the first thing, there is an internal division within Sri Lanka. So it's not very clear how this, that's bound to have repercussions and cause waves in bilateral policies, but it is not very clear right now as to which way it's going to play out as far as the domestic parties are concerned. Then Professor Ghosal was mentioning ethnic and linguistic commonality. You know, I think, yes, there is this ethnic and linguistic commonality, but it's also a tightrope walk for India as well as those countries, because the ethnic relationship that India has with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with, you know, we are the Tamils in Sri Lanka are a minority, except for in Nepal, where the Hindus are a majority. In the other countries, we are the minority. So those governments, you know, in order to, why I call it a tightrope walk is in order to develop a bilateral relationship with those governments, we have to keep in mind, I mean New Delhi has to keep in mind and always bear in mind that there is a majority there which is not linked to us ethnically and linguistically in each of these countries. So it is a balancing act there. And that majority can very easily be antagonized, more so, you know, if there are other disturbances within a given country. I mean, you see what's happening in Myanmar right now, but I won't go there because that's not the subject today. Then the zero-sum game that Professor Ghosal was mentioning, you know, Professor Ghosal said that it need not be a zero-sum game just because, you know, many of these countries are economically quite down and out, and they need the economic succor, as he put it, which is being provided by China, which has deeper pockets. I completely agree with all that. However, I'd like to add to what Professor Ghosal said. There is one inherent and intrinsic difference between China's presence and involvement in these countries and India's presence, and that is the fact that, you know, there are two things. In fact, one is that we have a democratic constitution. Whether we put that into practice or not is a separate story, but we have a democratic constitution. We are technically and officially a democracy. We have an election. We you know, elect our prime ministers. We have an elected, and we have laws and rights, and, you know, a lot of this stuff leads to projects that we begin not only at home but also in many of these countries just being stalled or put on the back burner forever. You know, all this happens because we are a democracy. Perhaps that is our fault, if you like, in inverted commas, in some ways. But being pitched against a country that is a totalitarian authoritative state like China is, and, you know, and on the other side of the fence we have India. So I find that the zero-sum game, I feel, you know, can happen between, it is not a zero-sum game. It shouldn't be a zero-sum game, but it will be a zero-sum game because there is no, you know, there is no political similarity between China and India. And of course, there's no military, I mean, the military capabilities of China are far larger than ours, etc., as Professor Ghosal pointed out. So that's about the zero-sum game. And then, you know, I think the main thing that India is concerned about in Sri Lanka, I restrict myself to that, is more so, I do not subscribe to the view that the Tamil question, so to speak, is really what is topmost on the minds of New Delhi. I don't subscribe to that at all. It has never been, and it never will be, and in fact, it is not even the main point for Tamil parties in Tamil Nadu. And I base what I'm saying on my conversations with Sri Lankan Tamils, you know, and Indian Tamils, many of whom were, I think I would like to refer to the late Cho Ramaswamy, who was a very famous editor who edited the magazine Tughlaq in Tamil Nadu. So there are many people who do not believe that the Sri Lankan, many people, especially in Sri Lanka, who feel that the Sri Lankan, Indian Tamils are really playing a cat and mouse game with the Sri Lankan Tamils, with their counterparts. They believe, the majority of them actually believe, whether they say it or not, they don't say it too often, but it's true. They don't believe that they are, they feel that they're like a curry patta, like a karve pullai in Tamil. They feel that the Indian Tamils put them into the curry when they need the flavor, and then when they're done with getting the flavor, they pull them out and throw them away. So they literally call it curry leaf politics, when you speak to Sri Lankan Tamils in the northern and eastern province. So that is, it's a question of perception. I think the Tamil question always comes up as a political tool, both in Tamil Nadu as well as in Delhi. And I also believe that it's been a very long time, if you notice, for all of you who've been tracking Sri Lanka, that since India mentioned the Tamil question, I mean, it's always mentioned, but the voice, New Delhi's voice was getting fainter and fainter about the Tamil question. Undoubtedly, when Prime Minister Modi traveled to Sri Lanka, there was a whole new course that this current government actually charted or began to chart, which was to focus on the Sinhala Buddhist majority of Sri Lanka and try and address them and try and win their favor, if you like, by landing there on Vesak Day, Buddha's birthday, and by making a lot of conciliatory moves towards the Sinhala majority. So the Indian government did try to strike a different course, but unfortunately that went awry because China has struck firmly to establish its not only economic superiority, but obviously its strategic superiority, because over the recent port issue, but we'll come to that at a later point. I just want to wind up these points and I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Gulbin Sultana. And, the last thing I wanted to say is that the Sri Lanka People's Party, Bahujana Peramuna victory, there I tend to, not completely agree with Professor Ghosal. I feel that the victory was not only because of the Easter attacks, during which was seen as a failure of the former government of President Maithripala Sirisena to provide security, it was a complete security lapse, a complete security failure. I think that the whole popularity of the Rajapaksas is premised on one thing, and that is the victory against and the defeat of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam after a 30-year-long civil war in which 120,000 people were killed. So I think, whether the Easter attacks had happened or not, there is undoubtedly, at least this is my personal opinion, that I'm absolutely certain that the Rajapaksas would have returned, because now you may ask, why were they voted out in the first place? And there was, if you ask the Rajapaksas, they will say that there was manipulation by India, and there was a lot of backroom, manipulation and all that kind of thing. That's a totally separate issue, why they lost and why they returned. We'll come to that later. But as of, these are just the points and the comments I'd like to make to Professor Ghosal's initial remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Rao. I think I do agree on that issue that you mentioned about, the success of the Rajapaksas. Undoubtedly, their success in dealing with the Tamil Tigers, the civil war over the last 30 years, had been one of the major factors of their success. Obviously, people were quite unhappy with the kind of economic decline and various other impacts of that civil war. So obviously, they had some sense of recognition of the services that the Rajapaksas had really provided. Whatever might have been the means that they had adopted, undoubtedly that played an important role. Anyway, before we go into any other issues that I might like to highlight, I think I'll ask Gulbin to come up with the presentations, and she may pick and choose whichever subject she feels more comfortable, or can bring in any new perspective that you find more relevant in terms of understanding the domestic politics as well as its impact on bilateral relationship between the two countries. Gulbin.
Thank you, Professor Ghoshal. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank Tillotoma Foundation for giving me this platform to share my views on India-Sri Lanka relations. And I also thank Ms. Sundarji for giving that background to explain the current political background, so that becomes my task easy. So I agree with the proposition made by Professor Ghosal. So what I'm trying to do is, instead of responding individually each of the issues, probably I would like to see how those propositions can be applied to India-Sri Lanka relation as a whole. So from the very beginning, like since from the 1948, probably I would flag some of the issues between India-Sri Lanka relations, and then we can continue our discussion. So now Sri Lanka, it's one of the most important maritime neighbors of India. Both countries have civilizational and cultural linkages for centuries. Now, the ancestors of the main communities of Sri Lanka, both Sinhala, Tamils, and even a section of Muslims, they originally belonged to India. And I think the Sri Lankans today also, they acknowledge the fact there's a strong people-to-people connection between the two countries. So due to this people-to-people connection and geographical proximity, any kind of development in Sri Lanka, be it political, economic, security, or strategic, has a spillover effect on India and thus affects the Indo-Sri Lanka bilateral relations. Now, the first internal political development in Sri Lanka that affected India-Sri Lanka relations after both the countries got independent in the late 1940s was the Citizenship Act passed by Sri Lankan Parliament. Because of this act, around 9 lakh Indian Tamils got disenfranchised, and the status of those stateless population, those enfranchised Indian origin Tamils, was an issue between the two countries for years. An agreement was, after several rounds of negotiation, agreement was signed between the two countries, but then again, it could not be implemented. So the issue lingered until 2003, I guess, where finally Sri Lanka decided to provide citizenship to all the Indian origin Indian Tamils stateless population who were living in Sri Lanka at that point of time. So the issue got resolved. Then there is another issue which impacted India-Sri Lanka bilateral relations in late 60s and also early 1970s was the issue of sovereignty over a small island called Kachativu Island. Now, again, that issue also got resolved after several rounds of negotiation and by signing maritime boundary agreements in 1974 and 1976. Now, those two agreements resolved the maritime boundary dispute between the two countries, but then gave rise to the fishermen issue, which is one of the major issues I would say in today's context in India-Sri Lanka bilateral relations, and it's still impacting India-Sri Lanka bilateral ties. Now, I think one of the major developments in Sri Lanka which have a severe impact on India-Sri Lanka relation was, of course, the ethnic conflict between the Tamils and the Sinhala community. And this ethnic conflict, it started quite early, but then it took the form of armed conflict in 1980s. Due to the conflict, about 1 lakh Tamil people of Sri Lanka, they entered India and started living in Sri Lanka, in India as refugees. And there was pressure from Tamil Nadu on the Union government to get involved in the ethnic conflict and urge the Sri Lankan government to resolve the conflict. Now, India's direct involvement in the 1980s in the ethnic conflict did not go down well with the Sri Lankans. So it had a negative repercussion on India-Sri Lanka bilateral ties. So from 1992 to 2005, Sri Lanka, India's involvement in the ethnic conflict was not direct. But then towards the end, like 2005, when the last phase of Ilam War started, that time India did provide its assistance to Sri Lankan government, Sri Lankan armed forces, to defeat the militant group, the LTT, on the condition that after defeating the LTT militarily in Sri Lanka would bring a political resolution of the Tamil problem. But unfortunately, after the end of war, no serious effort was made to bring political resolution to the ethnic conflict. And therefore, India is insisting on the implementation of the devolution, which provides, which was introduced in Sri Lankan Parliament on India's advice, and also also supported by Sri Lankan leaders at that time, to provide relief to the Tamil population to address their political grievances. So 13th, the Sri Lankans, particularly the Sinhala community, they see the 1987 Indo-Lanka Accord, because this 13th Amendment was an outcome of Indo-Lanka Accord. So the Indo-Lanka Accord that was signed in 1987 and also the 13th Amendment, the Sri Lankans, but particularly the Sinhala community, they see it as India's imposition on Sri Lanka. And therefore, there's a strong opposition against both Indo-Lanka Accord and 13th Amendment. Now, I agree with Ms. Sundarji when she said that after 2015, from Indian side, we acknowledge that the fact that Sri Lanka does mind that we keep putting pressure on implementation of the 13th Amendment, and probably we did not mention about it. But then we have seen that after 2009 presidential election, when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, we again started specifically mentioning this 13th Amendment. Before that, we continued to talk about political resolution of the Tamil problem. We did talk about the devolution or like federalism or some sort of thing, but we did not mention 13th Amendment, because at that time, I think the National Unity Government also initiated some kind of step to change the constitution. So there was an expectation probably at that point of time. India believed that at that point of time, India would not put any kind of pressure, because from Sri Lankan side, it is seen as India's imposition. But then we have seen that after Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, some of the members of the current administration, they started talking about repealing of the 13th Amendment. Interestingly, the provincial council minister, state minister of provincial council, who is the responsible for dealing with the provincial issues, and 13th Amendment, this amendment provides, makes provision for the provincial council. He himself is talking about the repealing of the 13th Amendment. And there's also support. It would not be fair to say that all the members of the Rajapaksa administration talks about repealing of the 13th Amendment, but there's a strong voice of repealing of this 13th Amendment. And that is why probably we, and also I would like to mention here that during 2015 to 2019, though not much serious effort was made to bring political resolution of the Tamil problem, but some grievances of the Tamils were addressed. For example, an UNHRC resolution was co-sponsored by the then National Unity Government of Sri Lanka, where Sri Lanka agreed to take a look into the issues of human rights violation during the last phases of war and all those things. And so, I mean, though we cannot say that there's some progress, but some measures were initiated. But then when this Rajapaksa administration came to power, they have pulled out from this resolution. They said, we are not going to co-sponsor this resolution. They did not, so Rajapaksa started talking about some domestic mechanism to look into the human rights violation. But I'd like to mention here that Rajapaksa were in power from 2005 to 2014, and people have seen, the international community has seen that there was an effort to completely ignore Rajapaksa government that time was trying to ignore the political grievances, to address the political grievances of the Tamils, because the feeling was that after the end of war, the solution lies on economic development of the Tamil areas more than political grievances. So now, again, and that is why probably in the UNHRC resolution, which was just passed last week, India abstained from voting, but then in Sri Lanka's India's demand for India's request to Sri Lankan government that Sri Lankan government must implement this 13th amendment, that is a part that has been incorporated in the UNHRC resolution. So when some of the government members, Sri Lankan government members, happy that India abstained from voting, but many, civil society members, Sri Lankan media, and some common people, and even some members of the government also started talking about, they're completely unhappy about India's stand at the UNHRC and incorporation of this demand implementation of 13th Amendment clause in the resolution. So, I'm not going into detail because I don't have much time. So the next issue, I think, which has an impact on India-Sri Lanka relation, Professor Ghoshal has talked about the zero-sum game, involvement of the extra-regional powers, other powers. But from Sri Lankan perspective, I think this strategic presence of the extra-regional power in Sri Lanka, that has been an issue in India-Sri Lanka bilateral relations. Not only now, it has been there from the very beginning. In the late, now, of course, the Chinese presence is there, but in also, I think during Cold War period, US was trying to make a presence, a strategic presence in Sri Lanka. Now China is already there. The problem with India is that India understands that Sri Lanka as a sovereign country has all the right to depend its relations with any countries it's want. But I think problem with Sri Lanka is that it has allowed the extra-regional powers strategic presence in allowed these countries, extra-regional powers, to venture into those areas which presence of these countries may affect India's security interest. I think that is the main issue. It's not just because Chinese are there, they are providing some assistance or they're providing some COVID assistance, India has problem. India's main problem is the presence of this extra-regional power in the areas, strategic areas which may affect India's security and strategic interests. Now, and another problem is that I understand what Professor Ghoshal has said, that Sri Lanka needs money, Sri Lanka needs assistance, and since China is providing money, so they take it. But we have to understand, Sri Lanka has been doing that from the very beginning. From, I think, even before the independence, they have been doing that. That sometimes they have this perceived notion, security threat from India. It's not real. Maybe sometimes they perceive it, and that is why they Sri Lankans believe that to counter India, to balance India, probably they need they cannot do on their own, because of course in every terms, the population wise, size wise, geographic size, population, military, every respect, Sri Lanka is much smaller than Sri Lanka, and that is why probably Sri Lanka will not be able to deal with India bilaterally, and that is why to counter India's influence, they need to have a presence of third country. And that is why we have seen even before the independence, one of the reasons why Sri Lanka signed a defense cooperation agreement with Britain, with the colonial masters, probably was one of the reason. There are lots of documentation that the letters exchanged by the British officials, that book is available, where it is very clearly written that many of the Sri Lankan leaders at that time felt that after British withdraw from India, there will be a vacuum, and India would try to fill up that vacuum, and then they perceive and that was a misperception that probably India would try to India would have some kind of imperialistic design and would try to occupy or affect Sri Lanka's sovereignty. That is completely baseless, because after independence, Pandit Nehru in several occasions have tried to convince in Sri Lanka that that is not the case, and India doesn't have any imperialistic intention. But then there were leaders, the President J. Jayawardene, who became president in 1970s. He was there in the parliament in the early 50s from the independence period. And leaders like him, and others also, they started saying that probably Nehru's India may not have any kind of imperialistic intention, but if any leaders with such intention come to power, they may affect Sri Lanka's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And there were many, after that also, there were many leaders in Sri Lanka who subscribed that view. And interestingly, when India directly got involved in the ethnic conflict in the 1980s, and we dropped the food and then to the northern areas, and then we sent the troops, and then signing of the agreement of the Indo-Lanka Accord, and exchange of letters with that accord, by which Sri Lanka committed to India that it will not allow any of the ports, airports, or strategic areas to the third country, which may affect Sri Lanka's, which may affect India's security interest. And also there was that the strategic assets like oil tank farm in Trincomalee, which were there, will be developed through joint ventures, and all those commitments were there. So many in Sri Lanka started believing, I mean, that view that India has some ulterior motive, some kind of intention in Sri Lanka. After that, I think that started, I mean, that belief started becoming stronger. And so the anti-India constituency is very much there. And they still talk about this 1987 in presence of peacekeeping mission. They still, I think, exploit those issues. And this anti-India constituency is being exploited by the political opportunists in Sri Lanka, and also some of the business houses who wants to continue their monopoly economic, because of their political interest and also because of their economic interest. This anti-India constituency has been used by this constituency from time to time. So that is why we have seen that there's a strong opposition in Sri Lanka, because after the end of war, as Ms. Sundarji has also spoken, that we have changed our views on these ethnic issues. We are probably not much focusing, we're not putting much pressure on this issue. So it's there's a perception in Sri Lanka that by signing economic deals or by signing the developmental projects, India is trying to increase its presence in Sri Lanka. So there is an effort from a section, within a section from Sri Lanka, within a section in Sri Lanka, that they try to see how they can reduce the influence India, because it is believed that but if India has influence, they will keep putting pressure on the ethnic issues and other issues. And that is why we have seen that lots of domestic opposition we have just seen that I think in February, India government of Sri Lanka has cancelled the trilateral agreement which was signed to develop the east terminal of the Colombo port between India, Sri Lanka and Japan. And even before that also, we have seen Sri Lankan government cancelling signed MOU I'm talking about Sampur coal power plant. The MOU was signed, after that it was been cancelled. Now there was, as I mentioned, about this exchange of letters with the Indo-Lanka Accord. That time there was an agreement between the two sides that the oil tank farm in Trincomalee will be developed through a joint venture. And after that, an agreement was signed to implement that agreement in 2003, but nothing much happened. It's still, I think Sri Lanka Oil Corporation, they only have 15, they developed only 15 tanks and they're using it. But now again, there's a call that they should take back those, and 2017 also, there was an agreement between both the sides to develop this oil tank farms between the two countries. Now the current administration, and they are giving the excuse of domestic protests, saying that people don't want these strategic assets to be developed by India. They don't want any foreign power. So there is a protest within Sri Lanka, and government wants to review those agreements. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that there is an effort in Sri Lanka which is trying to reduce the Indian influence, and that is a reality. But here I'm talking about, I think it would be unfair to say that that is the only aspect in India-Sri Lanka relations. Because of paucity of time, I have just flagged this aspect, but there are also positive aspects between the two countries. I think security cooperation between the two countries are very strong. People-to-people connection I have already mentioned, and then develop humanitarian assistance, development assistance. India has been providing the significant assistance in humanitarian assistance or other developmental projects, in terms of other developmental projects. And I think Sri Lankans also acknowledge that fact. And one thing one has to understand, and I think Sri Lankans also know it very well, that even if they have the full support of extra-regional powers like China or any other, the first respondent, due to the geographic proximity and also in terms of capability, whenever Sri Lanka will be in a crisis in terms of security or other crisis, India will always be the first respondent, simply because of the geographic proximity, and also because of the willingness, because there is a convergence of security interest between the two countries. Any kind of security issues, instability, that will have a spillover effect on India. So there is willingness on India's part to help Sri Lanka all the time, to provide assistance all the time. So Sri Lankans know it very well. And that is why, even though some leaders in Sri Lanka, they don't want to see increasing presence or increasing India's influence in Sri Lanka, but then at the same time they also don't want to make India unhappy or offended. So that is why probably sometimes they want to pacify India, and sometimes even if they are not very serious about that, but they would like to use the rhetorics, like, for example, India first policy, or like non-aligned policy, India first security policy, all sorts of rhetorics to pacify India. So I'll stop here and look forward for questions and other comments.
Sure. Gulbin has talked about the role of the anti-Indian lobby in Sri Lanka, which is very natural on the part of a smaller country, which always has the apprehension about the intentions of a bigger neighbor and all that. I think that brings us to another important question about India's uneasiness in terms of China's role in the Indian Ocean, and particularly its hold in Sri Lanka. I think many Indian analysts try to interpret Sri Lanka's cancellation of that agreement with India and Japan on the East Terminal port development as a kind of a pressure from China, resulting from the pressure from China that China had interests not to develop the Colombo port as much, because they feel that if Colombo port is developed, it will take the sort of interest out from the Hambantota port, where China has definite interests. But apart from that, I think the Indians also have certain apprehension. I think that apprehension comes from also certain developments that took place in the past, the 2008 docking of Chinese submarine in the port of Colombo at the time of Japanese Prime Minister's visit. And many people think that if China gets a stronghold in Sri Lanka, because of the strategic location of Sri Lanka, the hub in the Indian Ocean, it might be able to also affect India's security interests and India's movement in the Indian Ocean, like Chinese are apprehensive about India trying to do something in the Straits of Malacca, trying to sort of block it, put a blockade. Similarly, I think India also has an apprehension that if China becomes too strong in terms of its strategic involvement in Sri Lanka, they might be able to also blockade, India's movement within the Indian Ocean. So I think there are security uneasiness or security compulsions in terms of India's view about developments in Sri Lanka.
So just to go back to a few things that Gulbin said, thank you, Gulbin, for a very well-researched presentation. There are just a few small points that I'd like to make. The Muslims, when you spoke about them in Sri Lanka, you connected them to India. Now, you must remember that the actual Muslims, the first Muslims who arrived in Sri Lanka came from Arabia, and they came as traders, and this was more than 1,000 years ago. So not all minorities in Sri Lanka are directly linked to India, number one. Then you have the Yakkas and the Nagas, or the so-called original inhabitants of the island, the Aborigines, if you like, of Australia, their equivalent in Sri Lanka. So they are also minorities, and they're significant, for various reasons, because Sri Lanka has vast forest cover, for instance, and the Yakkas and Nagas and those communities play a big role there. So the Muslims are predominantly a trading community. They did not come from India. They were not a result of any kind of forcible, conversion or any of that kind of thing. They had nothing to do with the Mughals, and there was no Mughal invasion. So, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the community evolved in a totally different way in Sri Lanka. They were very blended, very, in fact, there are theories that the original Arab merchants who came even before the Prophet Muhammad himself. So a lot of them were not even Islamic, not Muslims at the time, and only later became Muslims. That's a small point. Then the Indian origin Tamils, whom you mentioned, I think it's very, very important when we discuss Tamils in Sri Lanka to make this distinction very clearly. This is the IOTs, the Indian origin Tamils, had absolutely nothing to do with the separatism movement in Sri Lanka. These are the Indians who were brought to Sri Lanka in the late 1900s or the late 1800s, I think late 1900s, predominantly to work on tea plantations. And the tea plantations were nowhere in the provinces that the other section of Tamils claim. I'll come to who they are. These tea provinces are in central and southern hilly regions of Sri Lanka, near Kandy, Hatton. These are all completely in different places. So these Indian origin Tamils, they may have gone through that disenfranchisement and the various points mentioned by Gulbin, but those were not the instigators for the separatism war in Sri Lanka at all. And as she pointed out, that issue was sorted out. They have citizenship now, and and all that, but they were never ever part of the civil war, the separatism war in Sri Lanka. This point is very important for everyone who's watching Sri Lanka, and I think there might be some students and other scholars here for whom this distinction is important. Then the other thing is that the fishermen's issue. Gulbin, the media writes about the fishermen's issue a lot, and it keeps blowing up the fishermen's issue a lot, especially the southern-based newspapers based in Tamil Nadu. fishermen have repeatedly told me as a journalist, these fishermen and other fishermen anywhere, I mean, along the entire coastal regions around the world, this kind of straying into somebody else's territory is very, very frequent. It happens all the time. And when you speak to fishermen themselves, most of them are basically, yes, there are some, unscrupulous guys with big trawlers who want to trawl out and fish out or overfish in certain fish-rich regions like the Pork Straits. But essentially, this is not a political, it's not a political move to let's infiltrate some fishermen into India or let's infiltrate some back from Sri Lanka into Indian waters. It's not like that. It's not a very clearly defined maritime boundary there. And this, especially more so because of the ethnic commonality, this kind of crossing over and being arrested happens all the time. It is not, so the media, and mea culpa, I am part of the media, but the media, a lot of the media writes about this fishermen's issue as if it was some kind of political provocation on either side, and it really is not that. What has happened is that during the LTTE war, many boats belonging to the LTTE or supporters of the LTTE in Tamil Nadu and in various other places disguised as fishermen or pretended to be fishermen in order to smuggle arms. Now, this has happened, and this is the reason why perhaps the fishermen's issue tends to spring into the headlines every time a fisherman is arrested, right? Now, the third thing is that now I'll come to the Tamil separatist question. The Tamils of northern and eastern Sri Lanka are not related to the IOTs, the Indian origin Tamils, whom we mentioned earlier. These are Tamils who came with the Indian kingdoms of the Cholas and the Pandya, the ancient Tamil kingdoms, which invaded Sri Lanka on their way to Indonesia and Southeast Asia and all that. These are those Tamils, which means that they have been settled in Sri Lanka for much, much longer, for thousands of years, and for much longer certainly than the IOTs, the Indian origin Tamils. Now, these are the people in the northern and eastern province, particularly, whose capitals you have heard of, Jaffna and Batticaloa. These Tamils, and there were some groups in Batticaloa who were fisher communities who came from Kerala. So incidentally, I think what a lot of you should know, even though this is a small diversion, because Bengali is the lingua franca here, and the Tillotoma Foundation is a well-known East India-based foundation, I assume, that the Sinhalas themselves are originated from the Kalinga Empire. So they are much more closely linked to the Bengalis, today's Bengalis and Odiyas, than anything else. But that's about the Sinhalas. Coming back to the Tamils, the northern and eastern Tamils, these are the Tamils known as the Elam Tamils, and they're still known as Elam Tamils. Elam has nothing to do with separatism. Elam just means land, it means island. And these are the Tamils who went for separatism and against whom relations between the Sinhalas deteriorated enormously at the period that Gulbin mentioned in 1947-48, and there were terrible riots. I remember my grandparents lived in Sri Lanka, in northern Sri Lanka at the time, in Jaffna, and there were terrible riots, and that's how the many small little splitter groups were set up initially, and some of them coalesced and became one, and the New Tamil Tigers, which as it was called then, eventually became the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam. Once it tasted blood, which was the murder of a governor of a province at that time, and that is the turning point that Gulbin mentioned in the 80s, which then went into a full-fledged and very, very brutal civil war, one of the most brutal civil wars in the world. And I've been witness to the war because for 16 years of my career, I covered the war as a war correspondent, 14 of which were with the Spiegel. So I was in the northern and eastern embattled provinces many, many times. And I cannot, ever forget the brutality of the LTTE and just the Tamils who were massacred, innocently massacred, and many public people, leaders and public personalities, and the list is there for all of you to find on the internet. We won't go into that. The other factor that's the turning point of separatism, Gulbin, and we must all understand that, is that this was not a war that the LTTE were fighting on by themselves. This was a war which was financed and supported indirectly, undoubtedly indirectly, by the Western community, by the very nations like the United States, like Canada, like Europe, the countries whose constitutions, who enshrine human rights in their constitutions, who enshrine the struggle for freedom in their constitutions, and whom the Tamils began to look towards for economic sustenance, because look, this was a poor country, this was undoubtedly a suppressed community in Sri Lanka, and there were undoubtedly problems with the Sinhalese and brutal riots and brutal, discrimination. But one thing you have to remember is that why were the Tamils discriminated against in Sri Lanka, the northern and eastern Tamils? Again, the source is the British. The British, just as they did in India and Pakistan, the British introduced their well-known policy of divide and rule into northern Sri Lanka, into Sri Lanka overall, which meant that the Tamil communities, the Elam Tamils, were highly educated, and they were educated with a huge, superbly, capable community and a fantastic intellectual and very highly educated community, and they were given the prime jobs in the civil services of Sri Lanka. This is the root cause of the resentment, and this was sown and nurtured and watered by the British as they were leaving, as independence began to, when the Indian independence struggle became successful, and when India gained independence, one by one countries began to gain their independence from Britain. And around that time, that is when the British, as they did anywhere else, just before they left, they sowed these seeds of discontent, and they sowed this trouble by dividing the Tamils and the Sinhalese on the basis of capacity and on the basis of senior jobs and junior jobs. And that is how the trouble began. There was major foreign interference. I've spoken about that. The 13th Amendment, that Gulbin mentioned, began to be picked up after Gotabaya came to power, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the current president of Sri Lanka. He came to power in 2019. Earlier, he was the defense secretary during the end of the war. And he'd never held a ministerial or a cabinet position or a state position in any way. But I disagree there with Gulbin in the sense that India did not start mentioning the 13th Amendment because Gotabaya came to power. India started mentioning the 13th Amendment for a very different reason, and I'll follow her sequence and tell you why. Now, India began mentioning the 13th Amendment. Basically, India sat up and started looking at Sri Lankan affairs very, very closely and recalibrating foreign policy the minute the Rajapaksas returned to power and Gotabaya coming to power. The reason was not, as I said, the 13th Amendment. The reason, the Tamils, the reason was China. The reason remains China through the rest of what Gulbin, and to an extent she said the same thing. But because by then, by the time Gotabaya came to power, things had happened that had pretty much established China's strategic interest in Sri Lanka and not just economic interest. And it became very clear that all the investment China was making was in the 90% of the investment China was making was in the name of strategic interest. I'll give you an example. The port of Hambantota. Hambantota is a port, it's the home constituency of the Rajapaksas. It's on the southeastern coast of Sri Lanka. And it was a port which was never used, it was never needed, it was never built. All ships, 70% of India's own traffic, shipping traffic is dependent on Colombo port. Colombo is the port that is considered a very coveted port for, the oil lanes, and it's right in the center of the oil lanes from the Straits of Malacca all the way through the Persian Gulf and to Western countries. So Colombo is the choke point, really, for if anybody wants to cut off anything or do anything. However, it doesn't harm to have a second port. Hambantota came about with a 90%. Hambantota was given when Mahinda Rajapaksa, who's Prime Minister today, was the president at the time. And that is the time when Hambantota was actually given to the Chinese for development. Later, under President Maithripala Sirisena, the Chinese had by then gotten this debt trap diplomacy, that stranglehold that Professor Bhusal mentioned. This had become so tight around the Sri Lankan neck that the Chinese then managed to extricate a 90% stake, a lease for 99 years on that port. Now, if you look at the map of Sri Lanka, you will see for the Chinese to get a 99-year lease on a port, which they have built, and to get 15,000 acres of land, farmland, adjacent to the port, on which they ostensibly want to build an economic zone. Now, you can see just by looking at the map what that means in terms of China's Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of all the feedback you're getting from all the other countries along the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of the debt trap, in terms of in terms of what China is doing along its own borders, in terms of what China is doing in the South China Sea, in terms of how much territorial claim China is making practically across the length and breadth of the what is today, and for the same reason, known as the Indo-Pacific. But we'll come to that. So by now, China had a 99-year lease on this port in Hambantota. They also had 15,000 acres of farmland. I traveled there at the time, and there were protests. There were protests even at that time. There were Buddhist monks protesting. There were ordinary trade union leaders protesting. And when you asked them why they were protesting, they said that, this is a sellout, and the government is selling our land and all that. Now, at that time, of course, the government of that time, President Maithripala Sirisena, who's the rival of the Rajapaksas were not in power. They, wrote off the protests as being supported by, more so because Hambantota is a Rajapaksa constituency, as being supported by the opposition, in this case, the Podujana Peramuna and the Rajapaksa parties, and the SLFP faction that supported Rajapaksa. So there was, that was very clear that there was a protest, and the protest was against China against our land being given to a foreign power. Now, the interesting thing is then, the last thing I'd like to mention is that we now come to this Colombo port and what happened. Now, sorry, just to finish this whole thing about why India sat up after Gotabaya, came to power. Yes, now I'll come to the Colombo port. Now, the Colombo port, the East Container Terminal, the agreement was cancelled all of a sudden, the trilateral agreement that they had with India and Japan. Japan protested, India protested too. But at this time, and this was not quite recently, about I think 3 or 4 months ago, I did speak to, I did a lot of research, because of the lockdown, I couldn't travel there. And I wrote a story, I think, for the print on this. And it was very, very clear. Every second editor and journalist and observer and analyst in Sri Lanka, who is Sri Lankan, both Sinhala and Tamil, made it very clear to me that these unions are, this is entirely at the behest of China, that the agreement was cancelled. This is the reason why, because, my question was that it's the same, they protested against Hambantota also, so it would be unfair to say that these are, so it was pointed out to me that everybody who is protesting the cancellation of the East Terminal, who is for the cancellation of the East Terminal agreement with India, is, it's strange how they're all somehow very close to the current government, that of the Rajapaksas. And why did the Rajapaksas then succumb to this, even if they're props, why did they prop these guys up to protest against India and to cancel the agreement? Under Chinese pressure. There isn't a single person in Sri Lanka who is not aware that the agreement for the East Terminal was cancelled under Chinese pressure. Now, ask yourself another question. Then I was told at that time, and I spoke to our High Commissioner in Colombo as well, and I was told by very high up Indian sources as well as Sri Lankan sources in their government that they're not so sure that the West Container Terminal offer, which was offered in lieu of the East Container Terminal, is going to be accepted by India at all. Now, for instance, officially, the Indian High Commission and the Indian government has not received any offer of any West Container Terminal in lieu. What has happened is the party that was investing on behalf of the Indians, that is Adani, and their local partner John Keels, which is a big conglomerate in Sri Lanka, they began talks over the Western Container Terminal. And the Sri Lankans began to float stories that, actually the Indians are very interested in the West Container Terminal. It's a better terminal. Look, even their own investors are saying that it would actually be much more lucrative and profitable for India. Now, the thing is that is stuck, because the Indians have not moved. India, New Delhi has not moved on that. It has neither said yes nor no. But what it has done subsequently are 3 things. And then I'll close my observations to Gulbin's observations. The Geneva UNHCR, the vote. This is the reason why the 13th Amendment has resurfaced again. I mean, if you ask me as an analyst and a long-term Sri Lanka watcher, especially the Narendra Modi government, look, this government and this foreign office, and I've watched these guys and Sri Lanka policy for decades. They have never, the Tamil thing has always been lip service. Even for, when it is lip service, even for Tamil Nadu politicians, you can imagine how much of lip service it is for New Delhi, which sits far away and is not even remotely involved or interested in Sri Lankan Tamil issues. And even in Indian Tamil issues, it's only now getting involved because there are elections looming. Otherwise, it has always been, the south of India has always been relatively, I mean, we know, all of us who are Indian know what the political situation in India has always been, whether under the BJP or the Congress, it is predominantly ruled by the North and Northern politicians, right? And this is one of the things that, much of South India also dislikes. This is the reason why the Tamil question, especially when under the Congress, what happened was that the Congress had a string of coalition governments. There, in coalition governments, the Tamil Nadu politicians obviously smelled blood, and they knew that, anytime they wanted to get, what they wanted, they would be the Tamil question, the so-called Tamil question, the Sri Lankan Tamil question. And therefore, most of India's foreign policy under the Congress was ruled by the dictates of Tamil Nadu politicians, who later became coalition partners that the Congress couldn't do without under Dr. Manmohan Singh's leadership. Now, the Narendra Modi government is the first government, as I mentioned earlier, that came in, that approach, that took a totally new and very novel approach to bilateral the relations with Sri Lanka. And I must say I'm a great supporter of that approach. By taking a very pragmatic view and shedding this repetition of the 13th Amendment, I'm absolutely convinced that there is a recognition in South Bloc that the 13th Amendment, which was written, in the 80s, I mean, it is no longer realistic. It no longer reflects the aspirations or even the ground reality in the northern and eastern provinces. The northern and eastern provinces have been developed tremendously. I traveled there through the war, and then immediately after the end of the war, began traveling there again for my book. And I was amazed at India, whether be it India, be it the EU, be it China, be it whoever. I mean, the development process was so speedy and so rapid. If you were to travel to these provinces today and you compare them to what you saw, what I saw 30 years ago, I was completely, I was like, just amazed at the amount of development there was. So there is a certain inherent truth. It's not something that India has not tried in Kashmir, or that other countries have not tried in troubled regions. When you pump in economic development into a region, then your, certain local aspirations and thoughts of separatism do die down. They are dampened, because essentially, why does all this happen? Essentially, separatism happens because people want to feed. People have nothing to eat. People want to feed themselves. People want a better life. That's the reason why separatism of any form happens anywhere in the world. So this 13th Amendment being brought up again is only because of China. I'm convinced of this. And at the UNHCR, if you read, India abstained, sure it abstained. But even the abstaining contained a message. And that message was very clear in the statement given by the Indian ambassador to the UNHCR, in which they specifically mentioned the 13th Amendment again after a long lull throughout, since Modi went for the Vesak Day celebrations to the cancellation of the East Container Terminal. The 13th Amendment was always a kind of an afterthought. It was just added as, just to suit some people, but it was never, it was never stated with the vehemence that the Congress government, the earlier Congress government said, brought it up with on occasion after occasion under pressure from their coalition partners. This government had decided that, and internal circles tell me that there was certainly discussion, and there was realpolitik in South Bloc. There is, in fact, and a recognition that the 13th Amendment in its form, the way it was written or back then, is no longer relevant or valid for these provinces. It has to be, altered. It has to be changed. In fact, we're not that interested in the 13th Amendment. Right now, what we're interested in is China. We want to rebuild relationship. We want to calibrate our relationship anew with Sri Lanka in light of the fact that China is taking over strategic control. And the minute that East Container Terminal was cancelled, that is when the 13th Amendment has crept its way back into all discourse. And the 13th Amendment in this case and now is being used by India, by South Bloc, as a very subtle and very smart, I would say, from the Indian point of view, smart tool. And it's finding its way into statements at the UNHCR. It's finding its way into every second thing that the, that's one development. The other development is that the Indian High Commissioner, if you notice, he has been, you know, I mean, the kind of visible, the kind of publicity blitz that there is around what he's been doing in Sri Lanka. It's very interesting. He's been, you know, visiting, he's been meeting with all the factions of the Tamil parties. There was such a long lull since Prime Minister Modi came to power that, you know, certainly there were some, you know, little trips to Jaffna and this and that, but there was an entire shift to focusing on the majority community and the majority politics of Sri Lanka, and that has gone back now. But it has gone back because there is a message in it for the government of Sri Lanka as far as China is concerned. It has nothing to do with the Tamils. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And the other thing that has happened is, if you notice, post the container terminal cancellation, suddenly you have the US-India bilateral relationship on a roll. Suddenly you have the Quad, which India was very awkward about the Quad all these years. They wasn't quite sure whether it wanted to get into a strategic relationship, military relationship, and whether Japan would join, whether Australia would join, to what extent India would be part of the Quad. You know, India has always tried to calibrate its other relationships with other countries, but now the Quad is in full swing. Your US-India bilateral relationship is in full swing. Strategic bilateral relationship is in full swing. The US is open for the first time in, I mean, this US has never had an embassy in the Maldives, for instance. Never had an embassy because the Colombo embassy always oversaw affairs for the US also in the Maldives. Ever since the Chinese presence and the Chinese stranglehold over Sri Lanka became known, all these things have happened, and the US is now opening, in fact has already opened, I think, an embassy in Male. That's another thing. And the last thing that has happened is all kinds of other countries which are suffering from China's expansionism, excuse me. South Korea, for instance, suddenly if you noticed recently, we had a defense talks with South Korea. So there is a convergence, a very obvious convergence, almost on a daily basis, of all the powers that are, I wouldn't say anti-China, but that seek to contain Chinese expansionism and Chinese strategic ambition in the region. And again, even the not renaming, but the reference to this region now, and in fact for over a year, as the Indo-Pacific region, that itself is an indication that it is not the Tamil question. It's really China that we're talking about in Sri Lanka. That's all I wanted to add for now.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting comment, and I think I agree with her completely on this point, that behind some of the moves and some of the strategies that India has adopted in its policy towards Sri Lanka was influenced by its perception of China's role in Sri Lanka. Now, another point that I wanted to, I think, support Ms. Sundarrajan's point is about the Muslims. Now, I think there is a significant
Sundarji.
Yeah, Sundarji. Sorry, I don't know how all the time that thing is coming up. There's a significant section of Malay Muslims. In fact, Muslims who identify with Malay and Indonesia, and in fact, they speak Malay. And I had actually spoken with some of them in Malay and Indonesian, because I do speak Indonesian and Malay language, and they're very comfortable. In fact, in Malaysia, there is a council called Bahasa Melayu, and I'm a member of that governing body of that particular body, and there is a significant representation from Sri Lanka. And I didn't have any knowledge that the Malay Muslims had settled down there. So I think one has to also take into account the character of Muslim population in Sri Lanka, which is not identical in terms of its origin from India or anything of that sort. Another point is you mentioned about the distinction between the Sri Lankan Tamils and Indian origin Tamils. In fact, Sri Lankan Tamils are always highly educated, and sometimes actually they look down upon the Indian origin Tamils. I have seen that not only in Sri Lanka, but I've seen that also in Malaysia. Most of the Tamils who are well placed in Malaysia in various establishments, actually originally they come from Sri Lanka. They're not the Indian Tamils, but Sri Lankan Tamils. So I think sometimes we don't take into consideration some of this, subtle point of differences when we try to take into account our policies or our sort of approaches towards this region. So I think now all three of us have already made our presentations, and unless Gulbin has some points to make, we can just open up for discussion among the participants.
Just one thing, Gulbin, because I just wanted to finish what something that you had mentioned earlier about the US and the British involvement in, so I mentioned this thing about divide and rule. The other point, very quick point I'd like to make is that it isn't, I am a strong believer in the fact that the Elam Civil War was exacerbated and worsened because of the kind of immense support, involuntary or otherwise, that it received from Western countries, okay? And the interference time and again in the name of human rights, each time to try and, force these Sri Lankan armed forces to lay down their arms just when they were on the verge of a victory and to sit, sit at a negotiating table. I say this because I know the Norwegian team, Erik Solheim and the people who, so-called peace negotiators extremely well. I've hung out with them over decades and decades, and I knew what was happening all the time. They kept me abreast of what was happening behind the scenes. And it is only now that they are beginning to acknowledge, years and years and years after all this stuff, that yes, there was, a lot of things that many European countries are only now beginning to acknowledge, that by calling them freedom fighters instead of terrorists. I mean, the chief gun runner of the LTT himself, whom I have interviewed many times, who's in a kind of a house, arrest, under a kind of house arrest. He has confirmed this. I mean, they say it openly. They say that the Western countries didn't do us, they supported us, they helped us, they allowed us to do money transfers, arms transfers, all that kind of thing. So why have the Western nations always had such great interest in a tiny little country millions of miles away? There's only one simple word: resources. Sri Lanka is a resource-rich country. It's immensely rich in resources, and it has been, and being an island and lying in the middle of the ocean, it's been the obvious, point of interest for Western and Eastern and basically everybody, foreign countries, in other words. So, sorry, that's all. Just carry on.
Okay.
Okay, thank you for the explains, ma'am, Sundarji ma'am, and also sir. I agree almost all the points you made. But it's just a clarification. That's why I mentioned a section of Muslims, because Muslims, again, only not from Arab, as sir mentioned, from Malay, also from Kerala, and Arab, of course, Arabs, they are origin. So that was a clarification. And there are several other points also, but on agree your Western interest. And also, if you see why, as you mentioned, that now we are talking about 13th Amendment because of China. I believe even when late 70s and 80s, when we provided assistance, of course, there was pressure from Tamil Nadu, but from government of Indian government of India, central government's point of view, it was not because we wanted to provide some humanitarian assistance to the Tamils, or we wanted to talk about the human rights of the Tamils. Of course, we all know there were strategic issues involved because of the US presence that time, President Jayavardene. he was getting close. So, I mean, the relations between US and Sri Lanka was getting so strong, and he was about to give that Voice of America station, and then also not directly to US, but also to the consortium of that Singaporean company to develop the oil Trincomalee farm and all. So
yes,
even
Gulbin, very
yes.
quickly, at that time, the time that you mentioned, and you were absolutely right, under Jayawardena, Sri Lanka had a very, very close relationship with the United States. But don't remember, India had an extremely close relationship with the Soviet Union at that time.
Yeah,
You see,
that
so
is
the big
Cold
powers,
War politics. Yes.
so the big, yes.
So,
that is what was going on.
I believe, and you write, it's about resource right from the independence period, like from 1948. Why did British, when they were withdrawing, they were giving freedom to India, Sri Lanka, all these countries, why they were signing the defense cooperation agreement with Sri Lanka? Because Sri Lanka's interest was different, but from government, from Britain perspective, they needed some kind of access that Trincomalee or Harbour to because that and Suez Canal issues were there. So they wanted to have this channel open. So that is why they signed the agreement. And even if on the base the agreement, the kind of assistance they were Britain provided to Sri Lankan armed forces, the naval support basically, the kind of ships they provided that time, they were Sri Lanka did not require those kind of big ships and vessels. Of course, Britain provided because of its own interest. So after that, also US was not interested to provide any kind of, they were of course providing, and that's how the big countries enter into the, because after decolonization, countries just cannot occupy the country, right? So they have to provide some kind of assistance, and that's how they make strategic presence in those countries. Even Cold War period, the US presence and our assistance to the LTT, it's not only Western countries provided assistance to the militant groups and war, we also provided assistance. So that there also our, I think, strategic interest was the main concern. We give, of course, we talk about this human rights issues, the presence of 1 lakh refugees in our land. Of course, those issues were there. But I think strategic issues are important. And even now, of course, I agree, because of the China's presence. And right now, what are the leverages we have? Because the kind of resource, the kind of money Chinese have, we cannot compete with China. I think we have to accept that fact that the economic terms, we cannot compete with the China. In fact, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he visited the first time to India, that time, I think with one of his interviews with Hindu, he mentioned that if the countries want to contain China, they will have to provide economic assistance. They will have to invest more. This kind of comments they were made. But so at this point of time, what are the leverages we have to contain China? Of course, we don't have the resource and money. The developmental funds which we want to invest, it's not that India doesn't want to invest on the developmental projects, but then there are other interests involved, the Chinese pressure, or like the domestic constituencies, they have their own interests. Because of that, we are not able to be present economically also. For so many years, we have been talking about signing this economic agreements and all, but nothing is happening, nothing is going ahead. So, of course, those are, I think, the main issues.
In fact, Gulbin, sorry, just to come in there, because you mentioned Gotabaya's first visit to India, just after the thing. May I say with great pleasure, I'd like to tell you that I got the first interview with him even before the Hindu, when he came here.
I think that time he said
and the interesting
right?
thing, and the headline, I'm just looking at it here, I pulled it up. The headline was, "We don't want to do anything to jeopardize the security of India." So he was very much aware that he's coming into, this was the first thing he said when he came to India in his first interview with the Indian media. And but then what happened after that, so it's obvious, very obvious. He came really, I got the impression, I spoke to him for an hour and a half, and I certainly got the impression that he intended to turn over a new leaf, because relations with India were very bad during the end of the Civil War, when it was still a Manmohan Singh government here. But then, unfortunately, things went awry after that under Chinese pressure, predominantly.
But ma'am, here I have a slightly different observation, because I wrote a paper, it's a co-authored paper, that is Mahinda Rajapaksa's India policy. So there I have observed the Rajapaksa brothers, I would say, because that time he also played an important role, Gotabaya though he was not a minister, but he was a defense secretary. So I think I would say, I don't know, should I use that word, shrewd politician or smart politician? Because if you see the Rajapaksha's policy towards India during 2005 to 2010 and 2010 to 2014, it's totally different. Because I think when they started war, Rajapakshas, they were very clear that when they come to power, they will start the war in 2005. So I think they did a proper.
But that's when it began, Gulbin. That's when it
began.
What
I'm trying to say is that time, 2005 to 2010, I think they did a proper research, they had a proper strategy. How do they go? How do they go ahead with the war effort and all? So that time they have realized, like, whatever support they have, be it from China or other countries or whatever, I think one of the country which can jeopardize the war effort is India.
No, but that's exactly the opposite happened, Gulbin.
No, that's what I'm saying.
No, so what happened was that India was the first country, and the Indians themselves admitted, India was the first country that the Sri Lankans approached for support for arms, ammunition, not only military support, but for moral support.
Let me finish, ma'am. That is what I'm saying. Also, they realized that it's very important that India should be on Sri Lankan government side. That is why we have seen a very good policy.
Yes, but India refused.
During 2005 to 2010.
India refused. China and Pakistan supported the Sri Lankan end to the civil war by giving them arms, ammunition, whatever they wanted, planes, guns, everything. India refused.
But then, even then, Rajapaksa government, they continued the engagement with the government of India, so that government of India doesn't do anything which may jeopardize
because India provided soft support. India provided radars and gloves and things like that.
You know? That's what I'm saying, that they continued that engagement with India because they did not want to, isolate India, or they did not want to offend India. But we have seen a different policy during 2010 to 2014 period. Sri Rajapaksa brothers, they have started ignoring India. So I think Rajapaksa,
what did you have in India at that time? You had a coalition government, which was firmly in the grips of chauvinistic parties in Tamil Nadu, which were fully exploiting the situation. That is what went wrong.
No, what I'm saying, the kind of policies during 2005 to 2010, the kind of diplomacy they had, the Rajapakshas had, they did not use that diplomacy. They did not use it during 2010 to 2014 period.
But nothing moved in diplomacy.
Exactly what I'm saying. And they were actually, Mahinda Rajapaksa was actually snubbing India, openly saying that I will, scrap this agreement and all. So you see a different kind of policy. So
the other thing.
The
other thing you should know is that the Hambantota port, which I mentioned to you, it was first offered to India. It was a purely domestic pre-election venture for the Rajapaksas because it's their constituency, and they first offered it in order to, as you say, mend ties with India. They offered it to India between 2010 and 2014, but India turned it down under pressure from coalition partners in Tamil Nadu.
Yes, ma'am.
That is only after that the China came.
Yes, not only that, ma'am. There are other issues as well. If you see the oil Trincomalee farm, it's not only now the Rajapaksa administration is talking about reviewing the project.
It's going to
even
be a
that
debate.
time also. Yes, so I see, following a different policy by the Rajapakshas. They see their interest for. Of course, everyone does that, but I think they are very smart. They know when
they are superb politicians.
When they have to reach out to India.
Every country has its own.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
you said that when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power, he offered and he was. So I'm not surprised with that.
No.
I'm not surprised with that.
You're getting the timeline wrong. Between 2010 and 2014, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, before Mahinda Rajapaksa last term of presidency, that is when the project in Hambantota was offered to India first, because because relations between India and Sri Lanka were under huge pressure during the end of the civil war in 2009, because of international pressure, because of Tamil coalition pressure in India, because of various reasons, and India's reluctance to step in and get its fingers dirty again or bloodied again, as it had done with the Indian peacekeeping force in the late 80s, right? So India did not want to get militarily involved under all kinds of pressures, domestic as well as international. That is the reason why they tried to make amends by offering India the port development when Mahinda Rajapaksa was president after the end of the war. But India refused because we were still under coalition pressure. That's what I'm saying. So every government will obviously approach bilateral policy with any other government, not from the point of view of philanthropy, but from the point of view of what is in it for me.
Exactly. I agree that. So my point here is to say, when you said that when he visited Gotabaya Rajapaksa visited India, he offered all these things. He talked about the security policy. So, and then after that, everything, so I'm not surprised, because I have seen, what everyone can observe, that they have done that in the past also. Suddenly, changing their policy.
You should limit your arguments now, because it's not giving opportunities to others to really
last one small point I would just like to mention here, that
1
yes,
minute.
Yes,
1 minute.
On the West Container Terminal port, development of West Container Terminal port, though as ma'am said that of course it was factually incorrect. Government of Sri Lanka is saying that they have approached Indian High Commission, or they have approached Government of India. But even I think they started the negotiation now. In fact, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election manifesto only, it's clearly written that they want to develop this West Container Terminal by involving the private partners. I think it was there in mind that they will never involve the government. I mean, they will involve the private partners. So, so I think again, we have to. I mean, the future of this development of West Container Port is also, we should not be very happy about the fact that we got it or something. Even the future, I see probably it'll have the similar kind of situation at the East Container Terminal. That's my point.
We can now invite questions.
I can talk about a focus at one area. Professor Ghoshal, if you can elaborate it as a question. Maybe if the speakers could elaborate on the vaccine diplomacy, the competition between China and, India, both sending in their vaccines. So I saw the last tweet from President Gotabaya's Twitter handle is about receiving the vaccines from China. And also another tweet that I saw was that, the India in Sri Lanka, the Indian High Commission in Sri Lanka, they have invited, President Gotabaya to, for instance, to I think some kind of military display of Tejas and others indigenous arms or the vehicles or such equipment. So how does that play out? The vaccine diplomacy and other diplomacy, the China and India specific competition.
Please, I think I would leave it to the others first.
It's a great question. So, in fact, that's it's one point that I think both Gulbin and I didn't mention so far. You're absolutely right. There was an interesting story I did again about 10 days ago. I think I got a question from somebody in Sri Lanka, a very senior editor, saying that the Covishield, the Serum Institute of India had suddenly cancelled an order of commercial order. This is not part of the the COVAX initiative by WHO, nor is it just the free vaccines that the Indian government presented to the Sri Lankans, but it suddenly and unilaterally cancelled an order placed by the Sri Lankans, and the Sri Lankans were wondering whether this was in retaliation for the East Container Terminal, and whether politics had something to do with it, whether the Serum Institute of India came under some pressure from the government of India. Now, I'm still in, two minds about this. I spoke to the Serum Institute of India, and they said, no, we have had to cancel this for many. And the thing is, what confused the whole issue is that Mr. Adar Poonawala apparently said in the letter that, we are one of the units in our factory burnt down, and that's the reason we're unable to provide you these vaccines on time. But earlier, as you know, as all of us know, in January, when that fire had happened, Mr. Adar Poonawala had said that the fire is not going to limit the vaccine at all because it has nothing nothing to do with the COVID vaccine, which is being produced elsewhere, and that's only a storage space or whatever it was for some other vaccine, right? So now, there's this thing back. So I called them and they said, oh, we are sending letters like this out to several people. I think there is a certain amount of pressure that the company has come under, Serum Institute, but I don't think it has to do in this case with, I think India's vaccine diplomacy has been, stunningly attractive, I must say. It's been an outstanding success all over the world. It's being appreciated all around the world. And, and this is something we as Indians, whether we are pro-BJP or anti-BJP or, these are the moments, a few moments that I think all of us as Indians should appreciate, and we do appreciate. So I don't think the Indian government was part of the withdrawal of the Serum Institute vaccine order in Sri Lanka, for instance. But at the same time, since you mentioned the vaccine diplomacy, please note that one of the first things that the Quad did when it got together, in an intensified form very recently, other than announcing joint military exercises and really, revving up the process of becoming what is very obviously a union intended to contain China. One of the things that they have announced is also vaccine diplomacy, and the vaccine diplomacy they have announced is quite stunning. Again, they are saying that India is likely to be the country which is going to manufacture the Johnson & Johnson single-shot vaccine meant for distribution all around the world, and Australia is going to be a partner in this distribution and in this manufacture. So certainly vaccine, I think what's happened is that the overall anti-China thing is also, as you rightfully pointed out, become a part of, or rather the other way around, vaccine diplomacy has also, sort of seeped its way into the bilateral relationship as well as the multilateral relationship in the Indo-Pacific region.
About the supply side of these vaccines, there could be another dimension to the problem. I don't know how far this is true, but someone mentioned to me that for some of the ingredients of the vaccine, you have to source it from the West. And the Western countries are actually holding it up.
Yes, the United States predominantly.
United States particularly, holding it up because of the intellectual property rights and all that kind of thing. So that could be also another reason why, maybe India has not been able to provide the kind of supplies, particularly the commercial part of it.
Absolutely, very, very important point. Yeah.
In fact, not only that, even in the case of Covaxin, I myself got the shot on 5th of March, and due date is 2nd April for the second shot. Now, about a week back, I got a message in my phone saying that the 4th is cancelled, and I'll have to re-register for the second shot. So I called the hospital from where I took the shot, and they told me that, no, don't worry about it. We'll take care of that. You come on the scheduled date on the 2nd of April for your second shot. But my suspicion is that maybe the supplies are going to be a little bit affected after 64 million doses being given to about 80 countries, and 61 million doses given within the country. I'm sure India is maybe facing some kind of a shortage. So shortage could be another factor for this. I'm not sure. This could be just a speculative kind of a answer to this question.
Another point that can be brought to the notice of the panelists is that I think while talking about the recent resolution, the UN HRC resolution, the president has said that Sri Lanka does not want to be dragged into the geopolitics of the Indian Ocean region, the great power rivalry.
Yeah.
So how does the panelists look at it? Maybe Dr. Sultana.
Bin, would you like to go? Yeah.
Sri Lankans, they have been making this statement that they don't want to be dragged into this geopolitics, the power rivalry and all. But because of, I think, the strategic importance of the country, they want it or not, somehow they, they are being dragged by the other countries. And I think sometimes probably government is also Sri Lankan government is also responsible because what happens when they talk about the following policy of non-aligned policy? Now the current government talks about the policy of neutrality, but neutrality means not neutrality, they mean non-alignment only, but they talk it neutrality, India first policy. But in practice, on ground, when we see, I think sometimes the governments, we have seen that they are explicitly or overtly going towards a particular country. As I mentioned during my presentation, that just strengthening bilateral relations with other countries, that should not be an issue. But sometimes probably the kind of statements they make and the kind of, the way they deal with certain countries, it seems that they are using another country against another. So I think that is the main problem. In case of this Chinese presence also, I mean, sometimes we have, for example, in 2014, our main concern was that the Chinese submarine, they docked in the Colombo port. So that was, in the Hambantota port, I think. So that was a major issue. So they will have to, it is because of their action at times, the country is, being dragged into this power rivalry. And whether they want it or not, they have to accept the fact that it's a small country and very strategically significant country in the Indian Ocean region. And the countries, the powerful countries, regional and extra-regional power, they are competing for their influence in the Indian Ocean region. So they would try to, influence Sri Lanka or other smaller countries to increase their presence. So they will be dragged. That's my answer.
Thank you so much. Maybe another point that I was thinking that, since we talked a lot about religion, we talked about the Tamils, the Hindu Tamils, maybe we talked about the Muslims, the other minorities, about the majority, that the Buddhists, when we talk about another country, the Mongolia, when we talk about Mongolia, much of our soft power collaboration with them, the cultural diplomacy is through the Buddhist connect with India. How far is it, can we do that, or have we done that with Sri Lanka, or is it feasible?
Okay. So, what has happened interestingly, Buddhism is almost all completely died out in India. Hinduism took the upper hand, and Buddhism is exists only in very insignificantly in pockets. So the only connection that we have is the Buddhist pilgrimage trail. This is something that that comes from Japan, from all the countries of the world, including Sri Lanka. So that is the one cultural link and connection as far as Buddhism is concerned that is kept alive. However, as I said, after Mr. Modi came to power, there have been attempts to identify oneself as the Indian, as India. Identify oneself also with Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Up to now, there was no religious identification. Up to now, there was a cultural and historical identification that, this is the trail, this is where the Buddha was born, this is where he lived, this is where he died, this is where he attained nirvana. So this was the pilgrimage trail. It was a tourism connection and based on historical ties. Now there was what they began, and again, as I said, it's very much part of realpolitik. I would look at it as realpolitik. They began to also emphasize the, if you like, the ethnic connection with Buddhists included, not just the Tamils. And that is what has received a setback of sorts now. However, I don't think that the Indian government is going to abandon that or has abandoned it just because the port container terminal contract was cancelled. On the contrary, what our Indian High Commissioner has been doing there now is also giving speeches in Sinhala. I mean, this is something which I've hardly ever seen a High Commissioner do. He's been traveling to meet if he's met all the very, kind of chauvinistic Tamil parties, he's also meeting the chauvinistic Bodhabala Sena and the Buddhist monks who are, many of them whom are very radical and in fact who form part of the anti-India trade union, protests about the terminal. So these two things have happened. There is another point I'd like to bring about, which we haven't spoken about, which is very crucial, especially because we talk about the United Nations and the UNHCR specifically, is that I just want to, what is this whole UNHCR resolution about? Because people tend to forget it. People just talk in lofty terms about human rights abuses by the Sri Lankan armed forces during the last phase of civil war. I just want to point out one small thing to you. I have in my book, Sri Lanka, the New Country, spoken to the generals who fought the war and spoken to ordinary Tamils, spoken to, ordinary Sinhala, spoken to a lot of other people. And in this book, there is a very clear statement which everybody has to be aware of. The first UN census conducted after the war, and we are basing this on the report of the UN Secretary General's panel of experts on accountability in Sri Lanka. Okay, it's available on the internet. It's dated 31st March 2011. Okay, so this is based on that. The first UN census, which was conducted after the end of the war, reported that 7,721 persons were killed between January and May 2009. These are the last 6 months of the 30-year-long civil war. That report was never released. Please note, that report was never released. Okay, so now the army says, the Sri Lankan army says, as far as we are concerned, our men are dog-tagged. Right, all soldiers are dog tagged. So we are accounted for. So we know that we lost 5,000 troops. They know that they lost 5,000 troops between January and May. So the question is, if a victorious army that was victorious and this loses 5,000, how many would the LTTE have lost? The general asks me, right? Shouldn't that figure be at least something close, if not more, considering that the LTTE were defeated, right? However, the general says, assume for the sake of argument that nobody was lost amongst the LTTE. The LTTE, nobody died, no cadre died, right? Then that surely means, according to the UN, 7,000 people died, right? And the army is saying 5,000 were our boys, right? So that surely means that 2,000 non-army people, right? That is civilians were killed, right? So now we're not even accounting for the fact that many civilians had already fled abroad during those months, January to May 2009, okay? Including some top LTTE leaders, okay? Then you have, when I spoke to the general, I still pointed out that the UN is actually saying the figures that were killed, this is this human rights violation, this is the reason why this resolution is coming up. The UN claims that between 30,000 and 40,000 people were killed. That is the figure that the UN still quotes now, okay, which is not substantiated in any document, okay, and it is this figure that the international community has been quoting. Then he comes back and he says to me, the figure, I'm repeating myself, the total number of deaths is, as I said, according to the UN, it's 7,721, including the LTTE. A total of 29,300 people were rescued by the army, right? Each and every one of those people are accounted for with the World Food Program, which is part of the UN, right? So let's not even think about the army, just think of what the UN organizations are saying. 29,300 people were rescued by the Sri Lankan army. The World Food Program acknowledges that, okay? And each and every one of those people are accounted for with the World Food Program because they were supplying food along with the army to these people. Now you subtract 29,300 living people from the alleged 30 to 40,000 dead people that the UN is today speaking of, right? What does that get you? It gets you the same figure of around 7,000 people that the UN's initial report said. Right? So this is, you see, the casual, then you forget about the UN. You look at the ICRC. The ICRC was extremely active in the Sri Lankan war belt. The ICRC claimed a total of 15,000 casualties, okay, of which 6,000 were Sri Lankan troops. Deduct that number. What do you arrive at? You again arrive at a figure of around 7,000, 8,000. Right? Now, again, if you assume that there were at least as many LTT cadres killed as troops, that is 5,000 troops, then that would leave 2,000 other civilian deaths. Out of that 7,000, you remove 5,000, which were troops. They were dog tagged. Everybody, all the agencies had this number. What does that leave? 2,000. So nobody is saying that the 2,000 people who died were 7,000 people totally died. That is what the Sri Lankans say. 5,000 were officially dog tagged. There are soldiers. So 2,000 civilians may have been killed in the crossfire. And the crossfire was caused, as many others, including LTT cadres themselves, whom I have interviewed, will tell you that they were pushing the fleeing leadership, the 12,000 LTT cadres who fled the last phase of the civil war, were pushing old and infirm people and civilians to the front towards where the firing line was, right? And using them as so-called human shields while the top leadership fled, and they have regrouped, many of them, in the West today. And there is even something known as the New Tamil Tigers of Tamil Eelam, which, with the full blessings of the countries that have given them refuge, frequently holds demonstrations and floats the LTT flag on the streets and all that, even though the flag is officially banned and the LTT has been officially put on a list of terror organizations and has been banned also. So there is a lot of, the UNHCR resolutions have to be taken with a large spoonful of salt, I would say, not even a pinch of salt. That's all. I just wanted to add that point about the human rights.
I think that answers, the question that was raised. I think one can really go on and on how these UN resolutions are sort of brought about, how the human rights organizations have their activities, and what kind of interests that direct them to, support a particular position and all that. Let's not go into details of all that in this. I think she has already answered very clearly if there is any other confusion on this point. So we can shift from that to any other issue that one may have in their minds.
There was something that Soham had mentioned about the Buddhist, the Sinhalese majority. And there again, I just wanted to add an interesting detail that the interesting fabric of Sri Lanka is highly interesting because not all Muslims are Sinhala speakers or Tamil speakers. Not all Muslims are Tamil speakers. Many Muslims are Sinhala speakers because it depends on where they live. If you have Muslim communities in the south, they don't speak Tamil, they speak Sinhala. So you have, and then not all Tamils are Hindus. That's another thing. Most of the LTT leadership was Christian, by the way. It was not Hindu.
Right.
Yeah, so Prabhakaran, whom I have met and interviewed, his middle name was Charles or something. Almost all and Karuna, who's a political leader today, Douglas Devananda, they're all Christians. And Douglas was not part of the LTT, but Karuna certainly was. He's the guy who actually split away from the LTT. So and Karuna is Hindu actually. He's not Christian, but and the LTT itself underwent a massive split before the end of the war. That's another reason why the Sri Lankan army was able to overcome it, because it underwent a massive split. The northern and eastern province leaders split up, Karuna and Prabhakaran. And again, there were accusations of the eastern Tamils being suppressed by the northern Tamil LTT, and that they had this thing of superiority, which Professor Ghoshal was mentioning. So that again, not all Tamils are Hindus, not many of them are Christians. Not all Tamils are, there are some Tamil Buddhists also, by the way, who speak Tamil, okay? And also there are smaller communities, as I said, like the Yakas and Nagas, and you have the Burghers, who are the, those of Dutch and Portuguese origin, countries which also call them Sri Lanka, and which, who also have, who have not really taken part or taken sides in this political conflict, just as the IOTs, the Indian Tamils, have not. So it is a very interesting fabric, and unfortunately, thanks to the media or no thanks to the media, we tend to classify Sri Lanka only into Tamils and Sinhalas, Buddhists and Hindus, and that's far from the truth.
And another interesting point which I observed during my visit to Sri Lanka, which I don't see in India, that is, sometimes the same family, a Buddhist family or Christian or Hindu family, they worship other religion as well. And for the first time, when the first day in my Sri Lanka, I was surprised that the Buddhist monastery, Buddhist temple, they will be surrounded by Hindu devalayas, which I have never seen in India. So that is a very interesting, I think, observation.
Well, in India, you have, Buddha is also worshipped as one of the avatars of Vishnu.
Right.
But we don't see that, in the temple inside.
No, sure, not perhaps not in all temples, but there are many places where, let's put it this way, it's not, there's no antipathy to worshipping Buddha by Hindus, that way. Whereas, there'd be a scandal if you had, let's say, I don't know, a figure of the Lord Jesus Christ or, something else in a temple, but there would not be that kind of consternation as far as Buddha is concerned.
Okay, so that takes care of most of the questions that have arisen out of this. I think now what I can do is to just end up the discussion by summarizing a few points that had emerged out of this discussion. Two dimensions that have emerged, two major dimensions. One, of course, is the internal dynamics of Sri Lankan politics and how it affects India-Sri Lankan relations. Then the other dynamics is the external dynamics and the role of the external powers, particularly the China factor. The elephant in the room is China, and how that is affecting the entire discourses on not only India-Sri Lanka relations, but also discussions and discourses on the Indian Ocean security as such. It is not bilateral kind of thing, but Indian Ocean as a kind of a common good and things of that sort, and how that could be affected by China's intrusion into it, and China's building up of resources and trying to eye on the resources, not territories, as it does in the case of South China Sea, but definitely in terms of Indian Ocean, it would definitely have some interest on its resources, as our speakers have already mentioned. So these two dimensions actually have their own sort of autonomy to a certain extent in terms of analytical tools. But what we have noticed is that India-Sri Lanka relations is basically a very complex relationship. And that complexity arises out of so many factors interacting with each other and intermeshing of those factors. Now, to get a clear perspective, I think we have discussed most of these dimensions, and we do get some kind of an idea or a proper perspective how these India-Sri Lanka relations are going to shape up in the coming days. Of course, one can't really say with any certainty. After all, social science is not pure science. We can only speculate. But things are changing. And I think speakers have also mentioned this particular point, that the geopolitical thrust is also changing. All these developments of Quad, India having strong interactions with the Western countries, and China's recent wolf warrior diplomacy, trying to sort of pick up quarrels with most of the countries. And interestingly, recently, in the month of end of January, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies have conducted a survey about trust quotient on China and the United States. The conclusions are very interesting. They say that on the one hand, they find China emerging as the most important country in this region, both economically and strategically. On the other hand, it is also going to emerge as the most distrusted nation. The trust quotient on China is going down. On the other hand, trust quotient for the United States is going upwards. Even in a country like Cambodia, which is almost a client state of China. So it is not only the geopolitical shift that is taking place, but also in terms of diplomacy on the part of China is also increasingly isolating the country. For example, identifying Australia as a chewing gum under their boots, a kind of an insulting remarks is automatically creating some kind of a problematic thing for Chinese diplomacy in the region. And I'm sure it is going to affect the Belt and Road Initiative, the debt trap kind of economic apprehensions are also playing into the hands, even in a country like Pakistan, which is almost the iron brother of China. There are doubts regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are also suspicions how China is going to sort of, play in the future in those regions. Okay.
Just very quickly, just one point that all of us forgot is about the Easter attacks, which were the most devastating attacks since the end of the war.
Right.
I mean, there was a backlash against the Muslim community, but fortunately that was contained. Immediately on the heel of those attacks, I traveled to the Muslim areas of Sri Lanka, and there I learned from the Muslims that at the local level, at the smallest village level, there never has been. It's much like in India. There never has been, and there never was the kind of animosity and the kind of, the thing that we were seeing. But it has a lot to do with the Maldives. If you remember, we had President Yamin, who was in power in the Maldives, who was very much in the clutches of they were seeing a rising influence of Wahhabi, Saudi Islam, that kind of influence in the Maldives. And both the Chinese as well as Saudi Arabia had literally bought out atolls, entire atolls in the Maldives. Chinese are still there, by the way. But the change of government, so at that time, there was a seepage of that form of militant, and intolerant Islamic fundamentalism seeping into Sri Lanka, because Maldives and Sri Lanka are very, very close, even in terms of culture and language and all that. So they say that this whole, conspiracy that was hatched, we have nothing to do with it. We're ashamed in the name of Sri Lankan Islam, that this is something that is entirely alien. And all of us would have noticed that there has been, that has considerably died down, even that kind of rhetoric out of Sri Lanka, ever since the change of government in the Maldives. And of course, the growing, presence of the United States and other watchdogs in the region. So that's really what I wanted to say. And I just wanted to thank all of you. It's been a really enjoyable discussion, and thank you for inviting me. And I hope we have more occasions to meet in the future. Thank you, Gulbin, for your really learned and, I love to see academics with so much knowledge. It's fantastic because very few people really do so much in-depth reading and, sort of research on Sri Lanka. And thank you, Professor Ghoshal, for your, the wisdom, the larger thing that you brought to us on Southeast Asia. That was highly interesting to me. And Soham for inviting me and for your very apt question on the Buddhists and the Sinhalese and the other one on the vaccine. That was really crucial.
Another point that I think I should tell from my own experience in Southeast Asia. Gulbin had asked that question about, religious practices. Hinduism and Buddhism are not sometimes separated in most of the countries outside India. In fact, India, because Buddhism had its end, that's why you make a distinction between Buddhism and Hinduism. But in the case of, particularly in the case of Southeast Asia, Hinduism and Buddhism were almost intermeshed. And many of them can't distinguish between Hindu pantheons and the Buddhist sort of, and take the example of Cambodia. Initially, it started with Hindu kingdoms, and then it became Buddhist kingdoms. But many of the Buddhists, like the influence of Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Trinity, is very much in Borobudur. In the stupa of Borobudur, there is a place where the images of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva are still there, but it is a Buddhist stupa. So I think this intermeshing of religious rituals as well as practices are very common outside India, and even in India. In fact, I've seen it in Calcutta, Mahabodhi Society, or for that matter, there is another Buddhist temple in the southern part of Calcutta, where majority of the visitors are actually Hindus, not Buddhists. So there are mixture of that, like, for example, in a dargah in Calcutta, there are a couple of dargahs when 90% of the visitors are actually Hindus, not Muslims. So, I mean, Muslims are there, but the Hindus visit them regularly, pray for their well-being and all kinds of things. So I think this, what you call mixing of this is very common in some of this, and that gave religion a specific identity. This separatism has created what we notice today is so much of enmity, so the more and more intermeshing of religions take place, I think there'll be more peace and stability in the world. Anyway, I mean, that's the comment outside the scope of our discussion. I think I should thank all of you for having a wonderful sort of, discussion on this subject, and also thank Soham to bring this panel together. Thank you all.
I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you, Soham and Tillotoma Foundation for giving me this opportunity, because it was a learning experience for me. I learned a lot from both ma'am and sir, and thank you so much.